Mindy, thank you. I'm going to share a screen now. That was a mouthful, so I appreciate you framing this up for us. So thanks everybody for inviting me. I appreciate it. And as Mindy said, I'm sitting in Charlottesville, Virginia. I spent most of my day today grading graduate strategy papers for my graduate students at the University of Virginia. So what I want to do today is I'm going to give you a quick overview of this topic and the areas within Agile and strategy that I want to cover. And I think, as Mindy said, the best way to handle questions, you're welcome to jump in anytime and ask questions. Just put them in the chat box, and I will try to pick them up along the way. I would prefer that this not be just a stream of consciousness, but more of an interaction with each of you. It'll be more fun and it'll be more interesting. So here's the plan. I'm going to give you a quick bio of me. It'll be short, I promise. And then we're going to talk about Agile principles and strategic or strategy principles. About my experiences in both the Agile project management world and then the Agile strategic management world, running and managing different organizations. My argument in this presentation and in my book, Plan to Pivot, is there's a call to action or a need for a new approach to manage what is an increasingly dynamic and changing environment for organizational leaders and organizational managers. And then I'm going to talk about some case studies. So I've done some consulting and some executive advisement for 2 or 3 different organizations that I think you'll find of interest, and they span a small manufacturing company, a mid-size philanthropic organization, and a smaller specialty manufacturing company, which I'll get into in a little while. And then at the end of this presentation, the idea here is that when you bring together Agile, and you all are Agile experts, so using the Agile principles to manage organizations, this idea of enterprise Agile, which has been written about in the last couple of years, increasingly been written about and talked about. My particular point of view is that Agile principles are appropriate and useful in managing all parts of the organization, not just specific technology and R&D kinds of departments. So again, questions, throw them into the chat box, and I'll pick them up as we go along. So first, a couple of definitions. The way that I talk about Agile is I use Agile as both an adjective, and in that way I mean it to mean how to move, or how to move flexibly and quickly, right? So you think about athletics or athletes that are agile, are quick and flexible, or Agile as the noun, which is Agile in that meaning is a project management method that, again, you are all familiar with, that is based on the 12 principles of the Agile Manifesto. And when I talk about strategy, our strategy is a plan of action that an organization puts together to achieve its goals. And strategic management is the management of that organization to guide it towards its goals and objectives. And then as we go along, we're going to talk about something new called Agile management, which is the overlay of the Agile principles that you find in the Agile Manifesto over strategic management processes, and using Agile management to actually manage organizations. So I hope I haven't lost you yet, but what I wanted to do is just lay the groundwork for the next couple of slides. So a quick background, in the early 80s to about 2000, so in the first half of my career, I spent in the construction business. And I started as an estimator, and I became a project manager, and then I managed project managers, and then I managed construction for a firm, became a senior vice president at a relatively early age of 27, and then a founder and owner-operator of a firm starting in the late 1980s. So I am really a construction manager, builder, project management specialist, strategy person in training. And I think I bring an interesting perspective to this discussion, and I think you'll see that as we go along. The projects that I have been involved in began as pretty complicated kinds of assignments. I did a lot of work in Manhattan, in New York City, down on Wall Street in complicated trading rooms. And as a result of getting some of that work, those customers said, "Hey, you know what? While you're doing and building our trading room, would you do our high-level apartment renovation?" And so we became both a trading room specialist and also a high-end residential builder. We also did some high-rise and some renovation work, and you'll see how this all knits together in a minute. But some of the qualities that you need to build complicated projects started to point towards Agile way early in the game. And as I say in my book, Plan to Pivot, I was doing Agile before Agile was cool. I was doing Agile before anybody called it Agile. And so I'm going to go along and tell you a little bit more about that in the next few minutes. When I launched my own firm in 1988, we specialized in medical design build, which was an extremely complicated kind of construction. There were few competitors, and again, we used Agile principles to actually run the firm, and we ran our projects using Agile principles as well. So that's that part of my career. And then in 2000, I moved my family down to Charlottesville, Virginia, and I started a career at the University of Virginia. And I was a senior associate dean and chief operating officer and chief financial officer of the two business schools at UVA, the McIntire School of Commerce and the Darden Graduate School of Business. I got my PhD from UVA in 2010. I've been an associate professor in the operations management area at Darden and in the higher ed administration area at the School of Education and Human Development. I've been teaching at UVA since about 2006. I taught project management at the McIntire School. I teach a graduate level strategy class and a graduate level leadership class. So I come at this, and hopefully you'll appreciate this, from the field, having been a project manager, having managed project managers. So I know what it's like to try and manage multiple subcontractors, multiple sets of plans, lots of complexity, figuring out logistics, and hopefully you can relate to some of that. So my portfolio at UVA over the last 20 years or so has been as the chief financial officer, managing the accounting and the finance, the investments, facilities and grounds, the hospitality operation at the Darden School, our risk manager, risk management, and then as an associate professor. And most recently, people seem to think that I have something to say, and so I'm doing more and more speaking. And my book recently was released, Plan to Pivot, Agile Organizational Strategy, and I'm working on a series of case studies. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I just wanted to give you that quick background. So I come from a place of feeling like, in my world where I study strategy, one of this sort of the modern father of strategy is Henry Mintzberg. And as I was thinking about, how does strategy get implemented in organizations, you looked at Henry Mintzberg, who kind of evolved from this feeling that early on in strategic management scholarship, strategy was considered almost an obsessive planning fixation, right? Planning was going to be the prescription to get you to your goals. And Mintzberg started there in the 70s, and by the 90s, he discarded a lot of that and said that organizations are changing, they're getting more complicated, and management really is a continuous learning process. And so the idea here is that strategy has evolved from a linear process to a much more continuous learning, what I would describe as a complex kind of continuous process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Prioritization and Hamel in the early 2000s, they're a very well-known a pair of strategy scholars, said that complex organizations need to focus on dynamic processes. Core competency, I talk a little bit about the smart teams, hire the best people you can, retain them, train them, and retain them, and create this idea of strategic intent and continuous learning as the core principles of an organization. So create opportunities for people to learn, appreciate what they do, delegate as much as you can, and let people kind of step back as a leader and let people do their thing. And then, so that was the signals that were coming out from the field to someone like me from the scholars. And then practitioners also were saying things like, this is a world of rapid change. These are very recent quotes from these guys. This is a world of rapid change. And we're working our business models. The business models that we're familiar with are being disrupted around the world. And this has really accelerated post-pandemic. The way that we do business, and I'm sure that you all are experiencing some of this now, the way that people are doing business is wildly different than it has ever been in the past. And then Gerald, a professor at IMD, said the journey towards Agile is this idea about breaking the success trap. And the success trap is that leaders often say to themselves, why change what we're doing if what we're doing is successful? And the fact of the matter is that the world is moving so fast and business is moving so fast today that if you're not continuously learning, if you're not hiring the best people, if you're not looking ahead, doing environmental scanning and looking ahead and adapting your strategy continuously, that you're going to get run over. And that using agile ways of thinking by launching experiments, piloting new ideas, increasing your investment in those ideas that catch on and that have some ROI, and killing others and growing opportunities is the way organizations and the way businesses will be run in the future. And so that's the basis of how I think about, well, if organizations are so dynamic and the world is moving so quickly, how do we as leaders and managers, how do we cope with that? And so I look to things and I suggest to my students and I suggest to my consulting clients that they look to processes and frameworks that they know, that they're familiar with, and that they know are tried and true and work. And for those of you on this call who are very familiar with Agile principles, this was my default. When I found my business growing quickly, and when I found myself at UVA in the middle of very complicated organizations, what I felt was the most sensible thing to do would be to reach back and look into my toolbox for something that I was familiar with, and Agile was sitting there. So I believe that when you apply the Agile principles to strategy and strategic management, that really is the next wave of how to manage complex organizations. So let's get into that a little bit. Strategic management principles, just to lay this back out for a minute, a strategy is a plan or a pattern or a perspective, and strategic management follows 5 stages. It's setting goals, analyzing the markets or analyzing the environments, formulating a strategy, deciding basically what it is that you want to do, then implementing those strategies that you decide to do, and then evaluating, assessing, and resetting your strategy. And so that's been the 5 stages of strategy that's been talked about in literature for the last 30 years. And I would argue that the most obvious differential that I'm talking about is that instead of going in a linear direction with one thing following the other over a period of time, that in 2021 and 2022, the world is going to be you're going to be running organizations in a cycle of continuous strategy. That once you roll out these new ideas, that you roll back into, okay, well, what's next? What else should we be doing? What else should we be piloting and testing and evaluating and measuring and then adding to our portfolio? So this continuous strategy is a core principle of Agile management. And just to give you some quick background, the discipline of strategy evolved, and I think we talked about this about a couple of minutes ago, is there was a prescriptive period early in the sort of Mintzberg, Ansoff, the 60s and 70s, when strategy making was very prescriptive and very linear. It's called prescriptive strategy. In the 70s to the 90s, it was more descriptive, and then now we're in this complex era. And prescriptive was about, how things ought to work. So you set out this strategy and you said, okay, well, let's manage and let's figure out how things fit together. Like we're not really sure. So let's lay out this plan and then follow the plan. Very prescriptive and linear in focus. And then during this descriptive phase, leaders, managers, scholars, consultants were thinking about, well, I lay out this prescription, it doesn't really work so well. So what do I do now? And so the descriptive period, or this emergent or adaptive period of strategy and strategic management, really dealt with how things actually are. Once you lay out a plan, now things start to happen. I have to adapt to these changing conditions. And remember that the globalization, the speed of communications, technology revolution was just starting to catch in the middle late 80s and into the 90s. So as systems started to speed up and communication started to speed up, industries globalized, the world got very complicated very quickly. And so the old plans of the prescriptive era and basically the descriptive era were beginning to become increasingly obsolete. And so we find ourselves in this sort of red arrow area, this complex area, where we need to figure out as leaders and managers and scholars how to adapt to these new dynamic and complex environments. And so that's what the playing field looks like for leaders and managers today. And so my thesis is that there's a new way to manage, and by applying agile principles to strategic management. And I created a quick list of agile principles. It's not all of them because I know that you all know that there are 12 agile principles. But the highlights are that the focus is on the customer, right? That's number one. That there's an intersection in the interests of the business and the developer or the product or service provider, right? So the customer's interests and the contractor's interests should come together. And that intersection is pretty powerful when you have customers that are willing to work closely with you. And then you can't implement and not measure and not adjust and not keep track of what's happening. And in organizations, that's not unusual that happens. That the greatest plans that get put in the field and then aren't managed often either are lack effectiveness or simply just get ignored. And the famous quote, it's attributed to about 25 different people, but what's not measured isn't managed, right? So manage, control implementation, and then this idea of focus on trusting the team, building smart teams and trusting your team. Agile principle, very important. And then face-to-face communication. Can't stress this enough. I know it's difficult for leaders in big companies and managers on big project teams to reach out to everyone and talk to everyone face-to-face, but it's critical. And I can tell you that in talking to, I was doing some executive advisement for someone who recently retired, a former athletics director, who said to me that one of his biggest regrets was that he didn't get a chance to go out and talk to his student athletes and his coaches enough. He didn't get a chance to spend time in the locker room. And that's just like the leader who doesn't get down to the line manager, or the manufacturing leader who doesn't get out on the shop floor. And you have to, as a leader, carve out time for face-to-face communication. And then this continuous cycle of pilot products. So new ideas from the smart teams, pilot them. So you get some market data because you've piloted them in the field, get some feedback, and then adjust it. So this cycle of pilot, get feedback, adjust, and relaunch is the way that Agile would work at the strategic level. In the same way as assess, revise, and re-release version 2. And then, it's wash, rinse, repeat, assess, revise, release. So that's the Agile principles. And with respect to strategic management, you can crosswalk those over nicely. They fit really well. In strategic management, if you look at strategic management theory, the needs of the customer, number one, generating strategic options, very important, focused implementation, smart teams, managing capabilities and matching capabilities with opportunities. It's a key tenet of strategic management. This idea of piloting new ideas is also part of strategic management theory. and then reviewing, measuring, and adjusting, and then start the cycle again. So there's a lot of similarities between Agile principles and what has become the strategic management set of principles as well. The primary difference that I see moving forward is that strategic management which was heretofore always assumed to be very linear in focus, and usually strategy making and strategic implementation takes a year or more. I would argue that that strategy and strategic management needs to be in shorter 4, 6, or 8 week bursts of this sort of much more of the Scrum format, or your expert Agile logo. Start, assess, revise, roll into the portfolio, bring it back, get some feedback, and then start again. So strategy, strategic management, and Agile have a lot in common. So I want to just roll back a little bit and just share with you. So that's my thesis. And so I was trying to figure out what the order for this presentation should be. And I would ask you at this point, if I were you, I'd say, well, what does he know about this? And so let me just share a few things on my early experiences in project management. So in working in Wall Street on trading rooms, in talking to someone, one of my clients, I said to him, what kind of business do you do in this room? It was a computer room. And he said they processed millions of dollars of transactions a second. And so in those kinds of projects, speed and quality were the drivers. It was much less about low bid, tough negotiation. It was much more about, can you do the work? Do you have the expertise? And it really required you to collaborate closely with the owner and the owner's vendors, the computer people and other people, to pull these projects off and to make them successful. And the same thing with high-end residential. Quality was the driver in those high-end residential projects that we were involved in. And so scope and budget and timelines were more fluid. It was more about quality. And again, collaboration with the owner was the key. So Agile is popping up in my world in the 1980s in these kinds of projects. And so again, like I said, I think I was doing Agile before Agile was cool. We were doing Agile for all of these projects. And frankly, we needed an approach where scope and quality were the primary drivers and not necessarily negotiating for the cheapest, fastest project, which inevitably, as you know, because you're all project managers, often have failure. In the same way, with my in my early career, I had some experiences with strategic management, and companies in the 80s, when you did this low bid work, there were often misaligned incentives, right? So there was an us and them kind of mentality, the owners and the contractors, or the owners and the developers, and this misalignment of incentives led to disputes and failures, and many projects never got built. And if you've taken a project management course, you know that in the federal government, the federal government is the land of dead projects and failed projects. Billions of dollars of projects that were unfinished and wasted because the owners and the developers never really aligned their interests. And so I saw that as a problem. I also saw that as an opportunity. And when I launched my business in about 1988, my company specialized in medical design build. I picked a complicated niche that required the things that we talked about 1 or 2 slides ago: a focus on quality, a focus on scope, and a focus on timeline. It's less about budget and it's more about quality and timeline. And why is that? Well, in the medical design build business, particularly in the area that I worked in, I did a lot of medical imaging center kinds of projects. The medical equipment that I was responsible to install, I didn't buy it, but the physicians groups did, was worth millions of dollars, $4, $5, or $6 million. And my part of getting those pieces of equipment installed was maybe $750,000 to $1.5 million. So relatively speaking, the most important thing for these physicians was to get the equipment in, to get it installed by someone who knew what they were doing, to turn it over to them on time so that they could get the equipment rolling, so they could start to be able to pay the bills, to pay the note on the multi-million-dollar debt that they took on with this equipment. So cost and experience and time in my business, in this business, were the number one priorities. We closely partnered with our customers, very much of an agile principle. The results spoke for themselves. We had increased on time and on budget results. And frankly, as a business person, our margins were higher than the rest of the industry and among the competition. And so, frankly, my business needed to move as quickly as my projects were moving. And increasingly, what I did was I applied my agile principles to my business and ran my business that way. So very agile, very flexible, partnering with customers, opening up my books to the customers, integrating information systems with the customers, customer focus. Customer was always number one. And that's the way that worked for me in my business. Then when I went to UVA and I came to UVA, I built a McIntyre School building project. I was the chairman of the building committee. And you know, at an institution like UVA, which is a state institution, it's an old line, legacy, traditional kind of organization. And it was a traditionally low bid environment. And I didn't really come from that, but I was trying to figure out how to help them get this project built. It was a new business school building. And so what I suggested we do is use a construction management approach, a cost plus kind of approach, to hire a construction manager very early in the process to manage the project and manage the engineers and manage the architects, come up with a guaranteed maximum price. And then what we did was we deeply collaborated. The construction manager, the architects and engineers, the faculty representatives, we all worked together to develop a plan that worked. We had a budget of $65 million and a timeline of 64 months, 65 million in 34 months. And we closed out the project at 71 million and 36 months. So for you that have ever been in the construction business or the software development business, to build a project that has less than 10% in change orders and less than 10% in terms of time extensions, that's a success by any measure. And again, we focused on time and quality as the primary drivers. And frankly, trust, excuse me, which becomes a real focal point in Agile. Trust and collaboration were core principles in that particular project. When I went to UVA as a chief operating officer, I also managed big organizations. One of the schools, the annual revenue was in excess of $100 million, and we had 450 employees. So it was a big, complicated state-run institution. And so in both my role in McIntyre and Darden, we used some agile approaches and implemented Agile at these business schools in this big, slow-moving state institution. So what did we do? Well, we converted legacy reporting systems into single entry accounting systems, activity-based cost accounting systems. So faculty, program managers, and the dean's office could look up on one click on a dashboard exactly where projects stood, exactly where the budget stood, exactly where cash flow was. Unheard of. I inherited, in both cases, when I moved into each of those roles, archaic 1970s and 80s versions of little standalone accounting systems with Excel spreadsheets, and a lot of hand notes were kind of cobbled together and called financial reporting. Well, we integrated that. We became more and more of a project kind of organization where we took new projects or new initiatives and broke them down into projects. Teams became the focus, smart teams that had faculty, professional staff, supportive staff, outside consultants. We built these smart teams around projects, launching new degree programs. I was part of teams that launched 3 or 4 new market-based degree teams. And so those were smart teams that did market research and that built dynamic financial models and operated very much like an Agile team. Customers, our students, our faculty were always involved in these kinds of projects. And then we deployed IT as a strategic advantage. So for you technology people out there, it was really important to create systems integration. Systems integration was the ability or the platform to bring people together. When people need information, it pulls people together. And so in my consulting and advisement role, I did some work at 3 different companies, and I'm going to share those cases with you right now for a few minutes. OEM Controls, Save the Children, and Store Your Board. But again, trust and collaboration were the core principles, and quality was the primary driver. So OEM Controls, I just want to do a couple of case study overviews. They're a heavy equipment controls manufacturer. They were having some problems with quality. They were losing data and losing some core knowledge, and their clients were becoming increasingly satisfied. I worked with the leadership team, and we deployed Agile across the company. And the principals there, the 2 Simmons brothers, launched something called the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And some of the dimensions of this, and I want to share this with you because when you say, well, what does this look like and how could this work for me? In a high-tech manufacturing environment, OEM created a very flat, project-oriented, flat structure. They made priorities out of note-taking, collecting information, and sharing structured information out around the organization. So very open and very transparent. They work closely with their partners and with other companies. And with respect to Agile and communication, Sam Simmons, the CEO, said there's no replacement for face-to-face dialogue, that their company runs 100% Agile. So what do they do and how do they do it? Well, they upload their notes, all consumer contacts into Trello. They use Trello, which is a project management program that some of you might be familiar with. They use SharePoint and Microsoft Teams, and they have built a platform that works very, very well for them. And then they put any kind of issue, a quality issue, a question, a new product, a new idea, they put them on Kanban cards or Kanban boards, and they load them onto Trello. And that's what these Kanban boards look like. So this is the next iteration of a part or a new joystick that's being designed and built. And so by doing it this way, they've really tightly integrated the sales, product development, and customer support. They really tightly integrate them. The Agile principles I want to share, and I think this is a very cool idea, is what Sam said to me was, no, we don't let good ideas fall on the floor. And so collecting and capturing, you know, those ideas that your staff have or that you have when you're walking around thinking about work, and you have those ideas come into your head, like we should be doing this and that and the other thing, right? At Sam's office, you write those things down. You enter them into, you just send an email or you put a text message together and you post them into Trello on these Kanban boards. So share ideas and collect data and collect information. And what Sam was saying was their engineers really enjoy and appreciate the system, and that trust and self-organization are rampant. My second case study is around Save the Children. And for you that don't know this, Save the Children raises about $150 million in gifts a year. As you can imagine, it's a children-based philanthropic organization. They are UK-based, but they have offices around the world. And the problem that I became involved in was flat to reduced giving levels and a disconnect between mission and marketing. And what Gemma Sherrington said to me, who's their vice president for marketing, is that the disconnect became that they became more and more around raising money and less around the mission and the passion of the organization. And so she felt like because the systems and the way they do business, the management systems were not great, that they wanted to get this systems integration done in order to bring the marketing and the mission and the messages all together. And so they created a new platform that is donor-centric. They reorganized the way that they do business. They flattened the organization, created feedback loops. They collaborate. They flexibly match the donor interest and the needs, and face-to-face communications. Very agile principles. And Gemma recently published an article around the positive effect that applying agile principles to Save the Children has had on the organization. The third case that I'll share there's an extreme sports storage company you can see on the left and the right. They build like garage storage systems or California closets for your garage to hang your bikes up and to hang your snowboards up and your skis. Very customized storage systems for extreme sports. And so they had an integration problem or communication problem where their offices in Virginia, they use Amazon for all of their fulfillment. They manufacture in Southeast Asia, and their designers are all over the place, all over the US. And so how do you bring all of that together? And so they wanted to create this integrated platform, communication platform, or management platform. And so what they did is they applied Agile principles and did something similar to what OEM has done. And so they use Amazon provides a lot of reporting. And so they use the Amazon reporting and integrated it on a Trello platform. Their reporting is virtual and up to the minute. Their partners, their manufacturers, and their customers can hit into the system. It eliminates confusion. And what they describe themselves as a company is very agile. They fully integrate. The full integration drives the business. And as an Amazon partner, according to Josh Gordon, the CEO, we have to be agile. And so the point of all of this is that these companies and many other companies, Amazon at the mega company level and other smaller companies coming up, are moving to Agile and applying Agile principles to strategic management. And so this new operating model that we've been talking about is the highlights are strong teams, smart teams, collaboration, lots of communication, lots of integration and self-organization, deliver early, deliver product early and often, be prepared for change because change is coming, have a consistent pace to your work, and trust the members of your teams, okay? Very agile. And now this is what I describe as the core principles of Agile management. And so how do you do that? Well, Sanjeev Augustine of Lightspeed says, you do it this way. You empathize, stay close to your customers, you connect, stay connected, communicating, lead with courage and purpose, adapt and be ready for change, and deliver solutions quickly. So that's the how. And at the why is that companies are increasingly doing projects. It's called projectization, that they're increasingly a collection of projects. And Sam at OEM and Gartner and Jamunden and others have been writing about this for the last few years, is increasingly organizations are project driven. So let's say they're project driven. Let's say we're really good at Agile because we're in the Agile Expert Club. We've been using Agile in different ways. Why not use it to manage the organization? And when you extend Agile to HR, finance, and risk, it becomes the operating framework. Believe me when I tell you, it's easy to say, well, you know, that's for IT and the R&D people to do Agile. Well, that's not true. There's Agile HR, where you manage your talent and you actively recruit and retain talent. There's active finance, where you invite finance onto your teams to guide ROI and to guide investments. It's a lot easier to ask for more budget when the finance person that's responsible for budgeting is part of your team. And so I think that all of these areas can be Agile, and that the whole organization can be an Agile, continuously learning organization. And so my book came out. It talks about this in more detail. Plan to pivot is a verb. And I think part of what we said is you've got to prepare to change or plan to pivot. Be flexible and be adaptable. And plan to pivot can also mean that it's a description of a continuum of activities from planning to pivoting, right? So plan to pivot can be an action to be prepared to change, and it also can be a continuum of plan to pivot. And so that what I would argue is strategic planning has become a plan, roll out, pilot, adjust, pivot, return, start again. And so that's the end of my formal presentation. I really appreciated sharing this with you. This is my contact information, and I'm going to pull up the chat. And let's see if we can take a few questions. Let's see. Are Agile principles similar to the PODC management model, a plan, organize, development, and control model? Richard, the answer to that is yes, it's similar, but agile management, I would argue, is more adaptive and moves more quickly than the POD model. But the structure and the way that workflow that the work flows in a PODC model is pretty similar. Does anybody want to ask a live question so I can stop talking for a minute? Does anybody have any live questions? You want to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask a question?
Jerry, we do have a question from our live chat from Lisa Cooney that is asking, do you have an agile coach to support and guide you as well?
So the answer to the agile coach question is you certainly can have an agile coach. The question that you're asking is, how do I find an agile coach that knows about applying agile, I think, in the agile management context that we're talking about today? And I think what I would do is I would find a good agile coach, and I would talk to them about this idea of agile management, that your interests are to operate more with more agility and to apply agile principles across the enterprise. So if I were looking for an agile coach, I would look for somebody who has some expertise or understanding about this material. I hope that answers your question. Someone else have a question? One of the attendees, feel free. I think joining a club like the Expert Agile Club is a great idea. I think part of Agile is continuous learning and creating networks of people of like mind that can help you consider how Agile is most effectively deployed in your organization is important. I think talking about Agile in your organization is important. I think that the more people are thinking about strategy, the more likely your organization will be more strategic. And so Agile is a great way to start those kinds of conversations. For anybody that wants to get a hold of me, to contact me, I'm assuming that you can get my contact information from Mindy. I also have contact information on the slide. Maybe we can after the polls close, you can take a look at that. But my email address is gstarsia@gmail.com, and you can certainly find me on LinkedIn. We look down a few more questions. Lisa Cooney, you asked me about, did I have an Agile coach? And the answer is no. I had a business coach who worked with me in my business. And because I'm a strategy scholar, I've been interested in this topic for a long time, and I'm kind of a self-taught Agile expert. I'm more an Agile person. I learned more Agile from the field as a project manager, and felt, again, back to where we were talking before, is I felt like I could apply Agile to, as I moved up in the business and moved up in the organization, I could use Agile to help me manage. And so that's how I got to Agile. And then I've done a lot of research in this area over the last 20 years. And you're probably talking to somebody who's one of the, I'm an expert in this area. Let's put it that way.
Jerry?
Does somebody have a question?
Yes.
Cool.
So in the early, when you were saying, before Agile was a concept, obviously you wouldn't have been calling it Agile at that point in time. But when you were implementing, one of the key challenges with actually implementing Agile, whether it be Kanban, Scrum, is the cultural challenge of implementing a new way of thinking. And often there's great resistance to that. And you weren't calling it Agile at the time, but obviously in order to get your clients and get the organizations to buy into it, what sort of change management were you doing in order to be able to make the changes and have the organization operate in the manner that you were striving to have them achieve?
Well, that's a great question. And I would direct you back to your you almost answered the question for yourself. It's a change management question, right?
Yep.
So any of these changes are, this is a cultural change, this is a culture shift. And so the change management literature is a good place to go to find that out. But your question is, what did I do and what did I experience? And for me, I did look to change management. And to me, the most important part when you're making any kind of a shift like this is to get small wins, right? Let's if I know I'm heading in this direction, what I want to do is let's start where the easy wins are, right? So my IT staff, my R&D staff, and maybe my sales staff are the most flexible, adaptable folks, right? The IT staff are usually have some knowledge of Agile. My R&D staff are usually the smartest guys in the room, usually, on some level and on some topics. So they're usually open to new ideas and they're willing to do the work to figure out whether or not this works or not. And then the salespeople just want to sell, right? So they're open for any idea that helps them sell better. And so what I would do, and my first recommendation would be, is to look for the low-hanging fruit in your organization. And what I would say, and what I write about in my book is find some acolytes, find some early adopters of Agile. If you can, in those areas where the acolytes live, that's where you start changing the thinking, right? And as people see that the people in the Agile area talk more, communicate better, have more fun, have more satisfaction, having more impact, as people start to see that, you'll see the flywheel of change start to move, right? And so now all of a sudden the manufacturing and the product teams go, hey, you know what? What are you doing over there? That seems like it would be really good because we have a problem we're trying to solve over here. And so, okay, well, let me come over to your team and let me teach you about this sort of Agile management or Agile principles. And so it's this flywheel of change that you have to get the early wins, look for acolytes to manage those areas, and then start to look for opportunities to spread it out through the organization. The one thing I will say for sure is you can't change an organization and make an organization agile by shoving it down people's throats. That
Correct.
doesn't work, right? So that would be my suggestions and my observations. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Can you pop that poll back out so I can see what the poll responses were?
Yep, there you go. We do have a couple more questions in the chat box. This was a poll at the end of the night. I can share the other two for you as well.
There are other questions, so let's see. I thank you for the thank yous. Verizon Retail Sales, I mentioned my thoughts about using Agile software for documenting and measuring projects. These are JIRA stories that can be thought for sales teams and quantifying it. Unless new products, it won't be possible to know how many customers are going to show up. From my point of view, at what point does like-mindedness become groupthink? I'm not sure that I'm talking about groupthink. We may be talking about different things. I don't think that an operating model that an organization follows is groupthink. I think organizations were slow moving, when big organizations in the past were slow moving, kind of linear serial operators, right? One foot in front of the other. Strategic planning took a year or more. Leaders and managers would create a plan and put it on their shelf and never look at it again. So in that way, organizations tended to take on the culture that the leaders and the managers, the sort of the dominant leaders and managers wanted it to be. I think in Agile gives you an opportunity to operate the business or your unit or your team in a way that we all agree and understand is necessary in these changing times and these dynamic times is necessary in order to do good work and in order to be effective. So I think it's less about groupthink and it's more about doing the work in a way that's most effective. Actually, is most. The research says that Agile teams have a much higher level of work satisfaction and job satisfaction. And so I don't think it's groupthink. I think it's doing business the way that people want to do business, and people want to be appreciated and have smart colleagues and feel like they're doing important work, et cetera. And all of those things, the customer focus, the close coordination, all of those things are Agile principles. So I think it's a very natural crosswalk to walk Agile over into managing organizations. Any other questions from you guys?
I've got another one. If no, I'll let anybody else go if they want to go. So if not, so within the Agile construct, typically there is going to be a product side of the equation, is what the title of the entity would be called. It could be a business analyst if we wanted to pull it back away from some of the Agile terms.
Sure.
But prioritization is the number one thing that that person is bringing to the team. Within, when you were working through your processes, how did you, in an example you gave where, no idea fell on the floor, how in the management aspect of it, as opposed to a technical Agile team, how do you guys work through the prioritization of what are the, bubbling up the things that you're going to focus on, and then sharing out with the team, and then making it forth to go and be successful? How did you handle prioritization?
Sure, that's a great question. Thanks for that. So I was thinking about prioritization, and I think about prioritization in this way, and have implemented and operated in this way. I think the nice thing about Agile is that everybody knows what the strategy is, right? What are we trying to do? Where are we trying to take the company? If you have a strategic culture that is managed around this sort of idea of Agile, then there's very few strategic secrets, right? We all know where we're going, we all know what we're trying to do. And we're trying to build new products, we're trying to offer new services. Frankly, we're trying to make more money for the company, right? So for me, I always try to put new ideas and decisions around new ideas through the lens of the strategic priorities of the company. So number one is I use it to filter out bad ideas. And so saying no, Steve Jobs' famous quote of the best strategic decision I ever made was learning to say no. Mm-hmm. So if it's outside of your strategic initiatives or outside of the company's core principles, core values, core strategic initiatives, then you say no. The second filter so if it passes the first filter, then why would we do it? I look to ROI. You can't help it because you're in business, and whether or not the ROI is a financial ROI, meaning in a for-profit company, it's profit. In a nonprofit, it might be funds raised. It might be funds raised, or it might be people affected by the mission or the things that you do. So evaluating it on the potential for ROI is the second sort of filter that I put it through. And then the third one, which is again an Agile principle, is what does the customer want? Does this support the needs of the customer? That's the most important filter. I would say that's almost the number one filter before ROI, before mission, is does the customer want this product? Does the customer want this service? And if so, what does that look like? And then you figure out, does that match our strategic interests? Will it get us some ROI? And if so, then back to my implementation, then is I pilot it. I pilot the idea. I'm not all in now. I'll pilot and try it. Pilot, measure, evaluate, either invest or disinvest, come around the Scrum circle. And then if you keep it, roll it into the portfolio and keep on moving down the road. I hope that answered your question.
Yes.
Cool.
I have one more if nobody else has any.
Sure.
So similar to the first question when I was asking about the PODC cycle. So in a past life, spent more time in Six Sigma. So very similar. I'm just wondering, as you've crafted kind of your thoughts on this over the years, similar to the PODC, Six Sigma in its basic form, DMAIC is going to be define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. So a similar kind of process flow. Yep. As you've studied it over the years, do you actually look at all of the, I know you mentioned, you know, your initial kind of influencers that presented the ideas to you, but do you kind of take all these other genres or flavors of the principles in over time and factor that into the way that you look at these things?
Sure. Yeah, so the short answer is yes. I've looked at almost all of these things. And as a professor of graduate students in strategy, I'm startled by the things I don't know sometimes. So they'll bring in some system or process that I hadn't heard of before. And most of the time, all of those things, the DMAIC and other things, are similar. They're process diagrams, essentially, or process descriptors. And I find them to be fine. But in my experience, they seem to be overly complicated. A lot of what I've seen in some of these, on some of the basket of different processes that are out there, I believe it's simple's better. That the 4 or 5, the 4 or 5 steps in strategic management, basically it's conceptualization, planning, implementation, measurement, and revision. That sort of logic, that's all you really need. I think people, and I with respect to my consulting colleagues, a lot of these things come out of the consulting world, these models, and that's fine, because frankly, consultants are useful, and but they're selling consulting services, and so they come up with new ways to tell the same story. At the end of the day, it's conceptual, analyze, so come up with a concept, analyze, so figure out, use a SWOT analysis or a PEST analysis to figure out internal and external strengths and weaknesses that you bring to that sort of, and then put a plan together, implement the plan, measure results, start again. So that seems to be a pretty common theme across all of those various and sundry frameworks and models.
Within the tail end, I would imagine you've probably looked at some of the things with SAFe or Scaled Agile Framework.
Yes.
They even boil it down to simpler of what you're doing is just inspecting and adapting. And
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of talk around the SAFe framework. Again, I would say that they're taking what is already working. Again, I think it's the basic agile principles applied to strategy. That works pretty darn well for me. And simplifying the process so that the most important thing to remember, I've got to tell you guys, the most important thing to remember is to don't spend a lot of time working on a plan. Come up with a quick plan. Come up with the measures that you're going to use to measure performance, right? Put together a dynamic financial model, basically an Excel spreadsheet that you can do if-then scenarios on. So if we sell 20 things, we make this much money. If we sell 100, we make this much money. So you sort of come up with these dynamic models and then pilot it, measure, and then adjust. So those would be my thoughts. Lisa Cooney, I hear you. I know it sounds like it only works in a small company, but that's not true. Amazon is very agile. There's hundreds of companies that are very agile. So the trick in big companies is to create a distributed model of agile because you're dealing with scale. And again, so you came back and said, okay, you just have to plan. I don't disagree with you. I'm not saying don't plan. Henry Mintzberg would have said don't plan in the 90s. I don't say don't plan. What I think a plan has to be the guide rails. And the process of planning is what's important, not the plan. So if your organization is planning and you have people thinking about planning, which means you're thinking about strategy and you're thinking about where the opportunities are, the process matters more than the plan. But that said, I always have a plan. It's always in my drawer. I always have it if somebody wants to see it. We talk about it and use it as the primary filter to make decisions. So I'm not minimizing the importance of plan, but I would say, again, back to the idea that I'm suggesting is the process of planning as part of the operation of your business, the planning and the making of strategy and looking for opportunities and piloting and adjusting and turning into the portfolio the projects that work and disinvesting of the ones that don't work, and then readjusting and moving forward is the right way to move forward, whether you're a small, mid-sized, or large company. That would be my perspective. I hope that helps you.
And in its truest form of the agile principles, the retro that would be a factor that with the teams, but that's what the whole point of it is. Periodic check-ins. You're doing the demo to see what the output is. You're doing your retro, but then you're coming up with small experiments of how you're going to change to ultimately more effectively operate.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. That was excellent. And I just got a note here that says organizations, so agile and strategic management, organization deciding strategies, which usually happens quarterly and or maybe annually or every few years, depending on the group. Yeah, I would say that in general, what I would say to you is, if you have an agile culture or a strategic culture, strategy is less of an event, and it's more in the DNA of the organization. This continuousness of strategy, this bringing the salespeople in from the field to tell you what the customers want, the bringing the customers into the organization to talk to you as an organization about what products they need in the field, integrating with the customer. Those are agile principles that apply really well in strategic management. So it's less of an event, like a strategic planning event, that you would be familiar with, because I've been through a million of them. I actually ran a million of them. It's much less about a planning event and much more about a process, a way of doing business, or the culture of an organization. And two more questions. Strategic management is an organizational level, organizational agile. Yes, you can call it organizational agile if you'd like. Yes. So good. Those are great questions. Thank you for those. Anybody else? I'm happy to hang out as long as you want to hang out. This is my favorite topic.
Well, I'm finally here.
Hey, Lisa Cooney, how are you? Thanks for joining me.
I'm good. I was on YouTube for a little while and posting in the chat, and there was nobody responding. And then I made my way over here, and then I accidentally had my video off.
Lisa, technology is a two-edged sword.
I apologize. It's been a long day.
Not a problem.
No, I think this is really interesting and really challenging. Because what I've seen in my work experience is either traditional organizations that have never heard of Agile and are struggling to figure out how to apply some of its ideas and principles to what they're dealing with, or alternatively, very advanced Agile companies, startups, really sophisticated organizations that don't have or maybe even don't respect the expertise that someone like you brings, who has studied strategic planning and management as a discipline, as an academic, like a really deep expertise. And so the feeling is, well, we're agile, we don't need to plan too much, we can figure it out, we can kind of wing it, and we're disrupting and we're moving fast and breaking things, and
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And then until they grow and grow and grow, and then they hit a point where, wait a minute, we need a strategy.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's this whole field of strategic management sitting here, right? And other
Absolutely.
fields related to it, like organizational development and all this other stuff, right?
Yep.
Just sitting there waiting, but they haven't had exposure to it. And so I find it's a really interesting thing. I see either really traditional organizations struggling with Agile in the first place, and then highly agile, brand new organizations trying to figure out how to bring in, for lack of a better phrase, ancient wisdom.
Yes.
Into the organization. And there's just an interesting dynamic between those two polarities that I've seen in my career.
Yeah, my kids, my children call me ancient, whatever you say, ancient something or other. They refer to me in the same way. I hear you, and I think the leap for people is to figure out, what did I do well when I was a small company that I should be doing well now that I'm a larger company? And people start to fall into, I must say, my MBA colleagues don't learn a lot of Agile in business school. They're taught strategic management in the traditional sense of strategic management. And so I do think that this is about learning and educating oneself. In my leadership class, I always tell my students, you got to be a lifelong learner and a lifelong student, that leadership isn't the same for any one person, that it's different for everyone, that you got to build your own toolbox and you got to fill it with your own tools. And that's the difference between, that's the difference between successful leaders and unsuccessful leaders. And it's also why there's very few successful leaders, because it's really hard and you have to work at it. So leaders, go ahead.
Well, it's different for each person, but also an individual leader needs to change their leadership style for the circumstances. So as they go through their life, as they go through their business and their business changes and grows, a leadership style that used to work really well may not work as well. They may need to adjust and adapt in different circumstances. And that's incredibly hard. It's like, being able to play jazz music and classical music at the same time, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. I think what it comes down to is, good leaders go to school a lot. They take, they learn, they study, they read a lot. Great leaders read a lot, and they're always trying to sharpen their sword and always trying to sharpen the knives in the drawer. And they're always, they surround themselves with really smart people who challenge them, right? I've always said to people who work for me, always, please take my job so I can go do something else that I'd like to do. Challenge my people, my staff, to take my job. Learn, study, train, get experience, and knock me out so I can go do something else. And the reason why you challenge people that way is because you want people to be reach and learn and grow and evolve, right? And that's where the richness of great companies comes from, is inquisitiveness and interest. And it's really hard to teach that to people. It's, you can find people that are like that. You can surround yourself with people who share that kind of inquisitiveness and interest. And I think I frankly think that kind of mindset and Agile and strategic culture all fit very nicely together. People who are organizationally interested first instead of self-interested, that are willing to, I don't want to get too far into this, but I'm a servant leadership. I espouse a servant leadership, and so the idea that mentoring and bringing more to the organization every day is important. And so I think all of those pieces and parts of strategy and Agile and culture and leadership all come together, and it's why it's complicated. These groups of people that we call companies and organizations are complicated because they're full of people that are very complicated. And as my friends would say, and I've said once or twice, I really love being a leader other than the people stuff. I love the people stuff, and the people stuff is the hardest stuff, right? It's the hardest stuff. So getting the right people in the room, as Jim Collins would say, getting the right people on the bus is a whole lot of it, frankly. I hope that was useful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm reading the chat.
Yeah, me too. There's a startup question. I think we covered some of this already. Is that this idea of Agile management. I think that some of this has to do with what Lisa said too. Is I think that startups can easily be Agile because they're small. And if you have Agile leadership at a startup, it's easy to continue to be Agile. The question is, how do you scale that? And how do you scale Agile?
Well, right.
Right.
What do you do when you go from, you're 5 people, then you're 20, then you're 50, then you're 500? Then before you
Yeah.
know it, you've got thousands and thousands of employees because you're so successful, which is great,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Now you have new questions to answer. You have new things to think about.
Yes. So my friend, my friend and colleague, maybe Mindy can put up my contact info again. My friend and colleague, Sam Simmons, who is the owner of OEM Controls, the CEO of OEM Controls. He's got 350 employees of all different types, and he ships product. He buys products and ships products around the world. And he's agile. You know, his company is crazy agile, and they work at it. And it comes from his commitment that agile is important and is the best way to operate. And he has his engineers now. He's got an agile advocate in each of his functional areas. So if you want to be a boss at his company, one of the leaders in his company, you need to have agile in your toolbox. You need to work from an agile point of view. And so that's the way the company operates. That's who he recruits. That's who he retains. And then he pays for people's education. He brings in guest speakers. That's just the way they operate. And I think that there's a lot of big companies around that are doing that now, and are doing that because they have to.
So I don't know if you saw this. This was a while back in the chat, but Jimmy Hay or Jimmy He, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. He wrote a question. He said how to influence organizational senior executives to apply agile concepts. And so it's kind of like if your executive leadership doesn't already, like you were just describing someone who gets it and who's trying to promote it and support it. But if you yourself get it and understand it and want to bring this to your organization, but your executive leaders don't, what do you do?
So Jimmy, thank you. And Lisa, thank you for bringing that up. There's a lot of
Yes,
writing
thank you, Lisa.
recently. I'll try to send you, if I can, I'll send an article or two. Lisa, if you contact me offline, I'll share some information about this. And Jimmy, you're welcome to as well. But there's some information about real agile companies have agile boards. And how do you implement agile at the board level? And I'm telling you, agile and agile management is a way of doing business that's got to be bottom up and top down and bottom up, however you want to say it. The board needs to be agile. The board needs to be more involved. The board needs to be on the floor. The board needs to talk to customers. An agile board and an agile leadership team begets an agile management team, begets agile department managers, and that's how it gets distributed throughout the organization. And it just becomes the way we think about things. It just becomes the way we do business.
So then the question is, though, and I've been there, so I kind of feel this pain that Jimmy describes. Like if you're
Yes.
in an organization and you believe and understand all this and you've read the books and you get it, and you've even had some success with your little team, but the wider organization they're not open to it. Then, the real question is, how do you, it's just the hardest question, but how do you get them to see the light? You can't just go to them and say, you're wrong and here's this book you need to read. Although that's very tempting, but it doesn't work.
So go ahead.
Well, I mean, you've described sort of the ideal, right? Where the board gets it and the executives get it and the leadership team gets it and, and so forth. And that is and a lot of places do that. So it's not impossible or it's not a pipe dream. But many of us get stuck in organizations where there's not that openness. And
Yes.
I mean, I suppose we could always leave and go somewhere else, but if you really care about the organization where you are, how do you bring that to your executive leaders?
Well, I mean, I think that, Lisa, like everything else in the world, sometimes the fit doesn't work for organizations. I hate to say this, but like in change management, the best thing you can do is, I say, think globally, act locally. So think agile, but act at, think about agile at the enterprise level, but in your world that you have control over or that you work in, if you can convert those folks to agile, I'm telling you that the research says that if you can create an agile team against a traditionally organized team, all other things being equal, the agile team will outperform the traditionally organized team all the time. And so you got to think to yourself, let's be agile. Let's run our department or our team or this project using agile principles. And hopefully the performance benefits will create some, will shed some spotlight on what you're doing and why you're doing it. And people start to say, hey, Lisa's team is killing it. What are they doing over there? And then it becomes well, they're doing agile and they're doing a really good job and she's communicating well and the customers love it. And it doesn't take long for that to kind of start to take on a life of its own. So I think it's like change management where you have to, again, think globally, but act locally, convert your team. And then I guess over time, I'm not suggesting that, anybody resign from their jobs, but I mean, over time, you have to figure out and decide how disheartening it is to be in a company that doesn't sort of think or act this way. That's what comes to mind for me. Somebody wrote, if leadership's not embracing agile, that was Nelson, it means they might not be aware of agile. That's true. And leadership, getting to see them as agile as a mindset and not a tool, can help them see what they might be losing. That's true, Nelson. I think what we're talking about, what I just described is how organizations change. Organizations change because leaders like board members aren't stupid. They look around and they say, hey, which of my units are doing really well? And if they look around and they say, hey, Nelson's unit is really killing it. For some reason, those guys are just killing it. And they go and find out that Nelson's unit is an agile unit that operates in an agile way. That creates some interest in agile. And if I'm a board member or a leader that's worth my salt, I'm going to go try to learn more about what those guys are doing that's working very well, because I want to do more of that with the rest of my teams, right? So I think that, again, the best way to do this, you're not going to, if you're not the CEO or you're not in the boardroom, you're not going to push it top down. So the only option you have is to push up from where you are. So, leadership can, you can lead, excuse me, you can lead from anywhere. There's a famous book, Lead from Where You Are, right? So you can lead from anywhere. So you can lead in an agile way and start that process where at some point in time, you're performing well, people are more satisfied, your retention rate is higher, your job satisfaction is higher, and people start to notice you and your teams, and then all of a sudden, people start to say, hey, what are those guys doing? And that's when the change starts to happen. Hey, what are they doing? Hey, they do this agile stuff. Yeah, I heard about that. Well, what are they doing that's actually agile? And you know what? They had the customer in for a meeting last week to talk about what they needed, and they brought in some experts, and they brought in the sales team to talk to the finance guys. And so they're doing things a lot differently over there, and they have a smile on their face, and they have some spring in their step. And I've seen this. And so I think this is the way it works. I think that you just have to change what you can change and hope that other people pay attention and kind of get on board.
All right, any more questions?
Not necessarily a question, but Jerry, if you can hold on just at the very end, just want to share something with you of how the world can be small at times.
Sure. Is that Brian talking?
Yes.
Okay, sure. I'll hang on. I saw the V Sabres. I suspected I probably knew you from some way.
No. Well, it'll be smaller than that, but
okay.
Anyway.
Okay. All right. Yeah, and I'd be happy to, this is not a commercial for Jerry, but I have a book out. It's called Plan to Pivot. You can go to jerrystarsia.com and order it. I have author pre-sales. There's a lot of what we talked about is in the book. I'm happy to talk to you offline if you want to contact me. So just reach out for me. I'm fairly accessible, and I may not get back to you like immediately, but I'll get back to you. So feel free to reach out.
Well, thanks for your talk.
Sure.
I
happy
really
to do
enjoyed it, even if I was on YouTube for half of it.
I don't know. If you have 30 seconds, I did a talk at Georgia Tech at the alumni hall there. And I went in on a Saturday morning, and I was assured that the technology would be all ready for me. And I was talking to 100 executives. So I walk into a room where I've got my laptop under my arm, and my presentation and my comments were about, were anchored by 2 interviews that I had embedded in my PowerPoints on my laptop. And I went in and I locked on to the technology, and I turned on my computer, and there was no audio on my interview. And so Georgia Tech had assured me that they would have a technology person standing by, who of course wasn't standing by. Of course, it's a Saturday morning. And so I'm digging into the technology closet, trying to figure out on the rack of audio components, how to figure out how to get my audio to work. And so the long story is, rely on technology at your own peril. And I missed the interaction of walking around to tables before you get going, that sort of introduce yourself and get to know people a little bit. I missed that, and then had to walk right into, like, it started 10 minutes late. The anxiety was so high. It just got to be not so much fun. It took a while for me to just calm down and get going. So technology can be a tough mistress sometimes.